It's a great honor to have you here today.
Thank you.
O professor Ronald Dore tem um extenso currículo, depois vocês vão receber, mas ele é realmente impressionante. Teve essa formação na Universidade de Londres, onde fez o seu bacharelado e depois seus estudos de pós-graduação. E teve várias posições aqui destacadas nas universidades ao longo do mundo. Né? Uma parte importante do tempo nas SOAS, né? Na Universidade de Londres, em várias outras universidades, em vários centros nos Estados Unidos, na Europa e na Inglaterra. Tá? Um conjunto impressionante de livros e hoje vai nos brindar aqui com uma exposição dentro dessa articulação que estamos fazendo com a rede Spider. Então, uma grande honra ter o professor Dore aqui. Thank you very much.
Right.
Okay.
Can I start?
Yes, please.
Well, let me stand up to say hello, good afternoon, and apologies for my incompetence, which meant that instead of arriving at 9:30, I arrived at 1:30. And I've just been given a very nice lunch with some of your professors, and I'm not very sure that my energy will last very long, but I'm going to sit down. I called the title the Competition for Hegemony in the Western Pacific. Hegemony is an interesting term. It derives from the Greek, and it was first used to indicate the fact that Athens became dominant over Sparta and all the others. It became dominant both in terms of military power and also in terms of cultural influence. Now, how many of you have heard of Joseph Nye? Joseph Nye, a professor at Harvard School, at Harvard University. Oh, this isn't enough.
No, it's okay.
Okay. Joseph Nye invented the terms hard power and soft power. And a hegemon in ancient Greece was the city-state that had both hard power in terms of arms and also soft power in the terms of cultural influence. And I'm going to talk about the development of politics in the Western Pacific, which have in recent years developed into a competition for hegemony. Take your mind back to 1945, at the end of the Second World War. There was no doubt that in the Western Pacific, the United States had total hegemony. Japan was on its knees, half destroyed by bombing. China also was much devastated during the war, but also was subject to competition between the communists and the Chiang Kai-shek regime. That was only settled in 1949 when Mao Zedong led the victory over the Kuomintang, which migrated to Taiwan. As a result, in 1945, the Western Pacific was an American lake. It was possible for ships to go wherever they wanted, however close to China, because China was by that time militarily exceedingly weak. But most of the more intelligent people, most of the intellectuals had left with the Kuomintang. So China, when it became communist China in 1949, was a country with a regime that was very, very uncertain of the way in which it would control the country, and an economy which was in shatters. There was a little bit of industry in the north, but by and large, and also in the south in Guangdong, but by and large, China was an exceedingly poor developing country. And in the first phase of development, of course, it was ruled by Mao Zedong and other Communist Party leaders who were genuinely committed to communism. And their first attempt at a big spurt in development in 1958 came with what they called the Great Leap Forward. It was suggested that China could accelerate the rate of development by developing a genuinely communist society and by dispersing industry. So the major feature of this dispersion of industry was the notion that steel should be made not in big factories, but in small factories belonging to different communes. The Great Leap Forward was a very inefficient, economically very inefficient form. But it also led to the collectivization of agriculture. The former peasants were formed into communes, and they all became the members of a cooperative which owned the land. And this, of course, disrupted agricultural production, because hitherto agricultural production had been produced in peasant families where everybody works hard because they gain immediate profit from their sales in the market. But this incentive to work hard and the organization for doing effective agriculture was a long time being organized, and there was a big fall in agricultural production. So that really set back China as a major power in the Pacific. It was unified. It was beginning to have some hard power, but mostly in terms of the military, the army. Its naval power was minimal. It had very few ships. And this meant, one of the things it meant was that the Americans, who had control of the whole system, could fly airplanes along the Chinese coast and pick up intelligence. They could hear all the telephone conversations going on among the leaders in Beijing. And the notion that America had a right to patrol the seas and to keep China down developed from that time. You may remember that one of the spy planes was shot down by a Chinese fighter, and that created a very considerable well, it gave the Chinese a lot of technology, because the crashed aircraft was taken to bits, and all the bits were then returned to America. But in the meanwhile, the people who'd taken it to bits had learned a great deal about how airplanes work, and that improved their technology. But there were, of course, many other, by this time, by the 1960s, there was beginning to be a certain amount of foreign direct investment, primarily from Japan. But it was at a very slow pace until in 1971, you may remember that Kissinger secretly arranged through Pakistan for President Nixon to visit China. And this was an epoch-making event. Well, it didn't result in close American-Chinese relations until 1978, when diplomatic relations were created. Because although Nixon was keen on developing ties with China, Congress was still full of people who favored Taiwan and had a lot of interest in Taiwan and were, in any case, dedicated anti-communists. So it wasn't until 1978 that diplomatic relations between the United States and China were established. But once the Nixon visit had opened the door, the Japanese in 1972 restored good relations. Restored diplomatic relations. The Japanese Prime Minister Tanaka went to Beijing and met with Zhou Enlai, who was by then much more important than Mao in determining policy. Zhou Enlai and Tanaka worked out an agreement. And one of the significant things, there were two significant things, apart from the basic establishment of diplomatic relations. One was the fact that Zhou Enlai said the Chinese people and the Japanese people can be friends because the Japanese people were as much a victim of the military clique as was China. So, we can wipe out the past. A question which in recent years has become very, very controversial. The other thing that Zhou Enlai and Tanaka agreed was about the, have you heard of the Senkaku Islands or the Diaoyu Islands? Has anybody heard of them? Well, they are islands between Okinawa and Taiwan. They formerly, under the Japanese rule, were part of Taiwan. But when the Americans established an occupation of Okinawa and got a lease on Okinawa, which lasted until the late 80s, because when the Americans took over Okinawa, they also took over the Senkaku Islands. So they became part of the Okinawa prefecture, which subsequently was returned to Japan at the end of the treaty by which the United States had control over Okinawa and had many bases in Okinawa. Still has many bases, but it has reverted to Japanese sovereignty. But the Senkaku Islands, although in theory they reverted to Japan, Japan gained administrative control over the Daikaku Islands. But the question of sovereignty, who actually owned those islands, was still unsolved. And one of the second important thing that Zhou Enlai said in these negotiations, when Tanaka suggested that they should settle the question of sovereignty, Zhou Enlai said, well, no, we also have strong claims to the Senkaku Islands, but let us not try to settle the matter now because it is much too difficult. So we will shelve it until, he used the word, the wiser heads of later generations. Sometime in the future, there will be more wise statesmen in both Japan and China, and they will be able to solve it. And for 35 years, Japan observed this agreement to shelve the issue of sovereignty while retaining administrative control over the islands, but never developing them. Right, so we get to 1972, and there is a great increase in Japanese-Chinese trade and in Japanese investment in China. A big acceleration of the industrialization of Japan, of China, as a result of Japanese foreign direct investment, which also, importantly, brought not only capital, but technology. And that was very important because the Chinese are very well educated. And they were able to learn from the foreign enterprises. The Chinese who worked in these foreign enterprises were able to learn a great deal of new technology and of organizational technology. And that gave a very big spurt to China's growth. But still, China in the late 1960s was a country dominated by Mao Zedong's philosophy. And there was what is called the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution changed, for example, it meant that entrance into the best university, the University of Beijing, which had hitherto been on the basis of intellectual, as a result of examination, it was only the brightest students who got in. But the criterion, during the Cultural Revolution, the criterion for entry into Beijing University was much less intellectual and much more about commitment to the doctrines of Maoist communism. And that, of course, meant that for 4 or 5 years, and because also some of the Western-oriented teachers at the big universities, as well as a lot of minor politicians, were expelled from the Communist Party and sent to, the phrase was sent down, which meant that they went to work in primitive agriculture. They were banished to distant parts to it. So there was a big disruption in the development of China. So I should have said at the beginning, if any of you have any question about what I'm saying at this moment, do raise your hand and ask me, because often dialogue is much more better than one-way lecturing. So don't hesitate if something that I say puzzles you. So we get to the Cultural Revolution. Finally, that is ended because the Maoists, particularly a group including Mao's wife and three others, the so-called Gang of Four, were ousted from power in 1969, 1970. And from 1970, China reverted to an education system in which it was intellectual performance that gave you advance and got you into the best universities. And it was also a system in which the relation between the central government and the provincial governments was much improved because there was no ideological division. So from 1970 onwards, the Chinese growth rate began to accelerate, but not very much. Not until Deng Xiaoping, who was a great figure in the development of China, Deng Xiaoping went on a tour of southern China, and he reported, while he was there, he encouraged a lot of private enterprise. And he encouraged the transfer of state-owned enterprise into private hands. He encouraged it, but it was a long time before that took effect. Industrialization in the 1970s was mostly carried on by rural communities. There were things called the town and village enterprises, which were owned by peasant communes or industrial communes as cooperatives. There was no private ownership. But gradually, these town and village enterprises passed into private management without the ownership rights. But by the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping was successful in creating private enterprise, and the result was an economy very similar to that today. First of all, the town and village enterprises all passed, not only the management, but also the ownership passed into private hands. So that within 3 or 4 years, I remember I went to a seminar in Beijing organized by the World Bank about the town and village enterprises. And the World Bank was then very keen on these. And so we had a seminar on how these town and village enterprises could be developed. But that was a time when the town and village enterprises were beginning to disappear into private hands. So an ironic conference and an ironic mistake of the World Bank. But that's the result of Deng's reforms and his encouragement of private investment and private operation. First of all, the small industries, and industries which, however, grow big. The mixture of private enterprises and state-owned enterprises was developed in the 1980s and still is very much the system today, except that the state-owned enterprises, and when we say state-owned, they were not all owned by the federal government of Beijing. You will see Huawei around here, which builds lifts and so on. I mean, Brazil has imported quite a lot of Huawei's technology and Huawei's products. Huawei is a Shanghai-owned state or state enterprise, not directly under the control of Beijing. So that came to be the definitive pattern of Chinese development. And when that was established, particularly because of the growth of private enterprise and the decline in agriculture, whereas in 1949, 50% of the Chinese population were in very low productivity agriculture. By 1980, that percentage had been reduced to about 35, and all the farmers who had been working at very low productivity came to work in factories and in service industries which had very high productivity. And that was one of the big secrets of China's 11% per annum growth in most of the 90s. Well, China is today the major competitor with the United States for hegemony in the West Pacific. Now, what about Japan, which is caught between them? Japan, as you know, was occupied by American troops from 1945 until 1951. The Japanese wanted to get rid of the Americans, and one of the prices that they had to pay was a security pact between the United States and Japan, which gave the United States a large number of bases within Japan itself, and also they had to agree that Okinawa, the area closest to China, should become American-controlled for at least 10 years. So Japan was very much dependent on the United States, and when subsequently the Chinese got the technology for nuclear weapons from Russia, and when the Chinese themselves had nuclear missiles, what was extremely important to Japan was the fact that the United States guaranteed that if China attacked Japan with nuclear weapons, then America would retaliate on China. So this is what has come to be known as the extensive nuclear guarantee. The extended deterrent. Yes, the extended deterrent. But Japan, finally, as the effects of the war, the devastation of the war, the destruction of most of Japan's manufacturing industry, began in the 1950s to rebuild its economic capacity, its industrial economic capacity. And by the time it was restoring diplomatic relations in 1972, it was already a highly industrial power. But the real takeoff in Japan began in 1959. There were lots of people who were saying in the mid-1950s, Japan has got a lot of intelligent people, it's got a lot of good technology. Why is it that it is growing only at 3 or 4% per annum? Well, in 1959, the rate of growth grew from 4% in 1955, and that was high because of a bumper crop, a big, the climate favored agriculture. There was a big output increase in agriculture, and that was in 1955 one of the things that lifted the rate of growth. But it wasn't until 1959 that the rate of growth began to approach 10%. There was a big political battle in 1960 over the security treaty alliance between Japan and the United States. That was a battle between the left-wing Socialist Party that wanted to get rid of American influence. And because the security treaty was a treaty with a limit of 10 years, it had to be renewed in 1960. So the left organized large-scale demonstrations to try and persuade the government not to renew it. But of course, they failed. They were much less. They were much less forceful. They had much less influence than the conservatives, who already had close ties with the United States. One of the important factors in this, was that part of the occupation's effect, the American occupation's effect on Japan, was the creation of a constitution in 1947. And at that time, the chief concern of the Americans was to prevent Japan from becoming once again a threat to American hegemony as it had been in 1930s, in the late 1930s until the end of the war in 1945. You know that the last stage of the war was as a result of the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that effectively ended the war. And the main objective of the Americans during that occupation was to make sure that Japan did not rise again and threaten the United States as it had in the 1930s and 1940s. So they insisted, and there were a lot of Japanese, the left-wing Japanese also agreed that the Constitution should contain an article, Article 9, which said that Japan will never have land, sea, or air military forces again. Japan would be defenseless. And the interesting phrase was the right of belligerency meaning fighting other people, the right of belligerency is abandoned, is gone. So Japan had this so-called peace constitution, which meant that it was increasingly dependent on as China began to be a major power, it meant that Japan was increasingly dependent for its protection on the threat that America would use nuclear weapons on China in order to, if ever Japan were attacked. One thing about the peace constitution, I mean, in spite of the very clear language of this Article 9, the Japanese Supreme Court delivered a judgment which says that Article 9 applied only to aggressive war and not to self-defense. So Japan began to build up what were known as the self-defense forces. Until today, the self-defense forces, in terms of firepower, in terms of submarine power and of aircraft power, is still superior to China. If there ever were a war over the disputed Senkaku Islands, at this moment, Japan would probably win. But of course, China is now increasing its military expenditure at a rate of 12% per annum. Still, military expenditure is only 2% of China's GDP, but rapidly increasing, whereas America's portion of GDP, which is devoted to military, devoted to the military, particularly the Air Force and the Navy, is something like 4 to 5% of GDP. So the Chinese have quite a long way to catch up. They first of all will, within 5 years, they will catch up with and be stronger than Japan. But the point at which the Chinese military forces could combat the American military forces is much further in the future. Still, as in the example of the fighter plane, the West Pacific is an American lake. But gradually, the Chinese are trying to push the Americans back to Hawaii rather than allow them to use the islands and bases in the bordering the South China Sea. This goes by the term of access denial, and it consists of submarines following American warships. It consists of helicopters buzzing American planes. And until they move out to what the Chinese call the first chain of islands, which would leave both the South China Sea and a lot of the North China Sea into under Chinese control. And that competition has gradually become the most important competition. China and the United States still have relatively easy, relatively friendly economic relations, but not military relations. Every year, the Congress of the United States publishes an assessment of China's militarization. And their last assessment in 2013 was a strong attack on China because China had succeeded in hacking into, in getting inside the computers of a lot of industrial firms and also of the government in Washington. But primarily the Chinese were using hacking as a means of gaining technology by hacking into the private networks of individual firms. And this obviously has caused enormous alarm in the United States because the United States' capacity to hack into China, while still developing, is still very much a matter of competition in which America is not necessarily winning in the ability to destroy the computers. You know, America obviously has this ability because recently it tried to, it hacked into all the computers in Iran, all the important computers in Iran, as well as organizing Israel organized the assassination of nuclear scientists. And Israel and the United States together developed hacking in the ability to hack into the computers of any country that threatened it. To continue the story of growth in Japan, in the I told you that by 1959 the growth rate had reached 10%. After the struggle, the great demonstrations and internal fight over the renewal of the American Security Treaty, a new prime minister who was an economist and a very clever economist, he declared that we shall double GDP in 10 years. And that created a sense of optimism. It led to a high level of investment, so that in fact the output of the Japanese economy was doubled not in 10 years but in 5 years. By 1965 it had doubled over 1960. And the 1960s, of course, were a period of very high growth, which only began to slow down in the late 1970s. So that meant that Japan became a major industrial power and able to challenge China over the possession of these Senkaku Islands. One of the interesting things was that a Japanese politician who became very famous, he was a teenage novelist, and he wrote a bestseller called the Children of the Sun, which was almost pornographic. It hit the level. It reached the level of just escaping the censorship for obscenity. That was how he first made his name. And then in the 1960s, he again became a famous figure because he, along with the president of Sony, wrote a book called The Japan That Can Say No. And the burden of this book was that the American dominance of Japan should cease, because America is increasingly dependent on Japanese high technology products for its missiles and its nuclear bombs and whatever. So America is dependent on our brains, he said, and we should say no to America. That became very notorious. The Pentagon produced a pirated translation which it distributed all over the world. I was offered a copy of that Pentagon pirated translation by by an electronic manufacturer in Bologna. It got even that far. So it made this man called Ishiwara a famous figure, and so famous that he entered the election for governor of Tokyo and was the governor of Tokyo for 3 4-year terms, for 12 years. And it was Ishiwara who tried to incorporate the Senkaku Islands into the metropolitan area of Tokyo, put it under Tokyo's local government. This was a bit bizarre. The Tokyo metropolis spread south over a little chain of islands, but from the southmost island to the Daikaku is 1,000 kilometers. And Ishiwara was proposing that. Now, the government of Japan was alarmed because they saw that it would be the end of the agreement with Zhou Enlai to leave the issue to later generations. And For example, the Japanese ambassador in Beijing, a man he was a rare businessman in diplomacy. It was very rare to have anybody other than career diplomats in important posts. He was disliked by the Foreign Office because he was an intruder. And he gave an interview to the Financial Times of London, in which he said, if Ishiwara succeeds in developing the Senkaku Islands, there will be hell to pay. It will cause great disruption in our relations with China. Well, the Ishiwara faction in Japan was strong enough to get that ambassador brought back, to get him sacked, to get him dismissed from the service. But it wasn't, the Ishiwara faction was not strong enough to have a majority in the majority stake in the government. And the government at that time was in the hands of the third prime minister of the JDP, the Japan Development Party. The Japan Democratic Party, which was somewhat to the left. It started off in 2009. For the first time since 1947, the Liberal Democratic Party lost the election to the Japan Democratic Party. And as a result, the first prime minister was a radical prime minister who tried to get the Americans out of the bases that they still retained in Okinawa, particularly one called Tenma. But the opposition, both from America and internal, was such that he had to give way to somebody else. And the third prime minister of the JDP was a man whose ideas he had originally been in the Liberal Democratic Party and broken away. And the government at that time was indistinguishable from the conservative government of the LDP that had held power for 40 years. But nevertheless, they were alarmed at the possibility of trouble with China if Ishiwara went ahead. And so it so happened that these islands had been given by the Okinawa prefecture private ownership. Private ownership had started in 1885 when a group of Japanese went to hunt albatross and when they had made the albatross almost extinct, they started on fishing, and they had a very effective factory which dried bonito. Do you know there's a fish called bonito which the Japanese love, and which they dry until it is somewhat like a piece of wood. And they make shavings from the piece of wood in order to make their soups. Now, much of these bonito factories, much of these bonitos came from the factory on the Senkaku Islands until 1940. But in 1940, the owners of the land in the Daikaku Islands were refused petrol that they needed, refused gasoline, which they needed for drying the bonito. So they went back to Japan, and the islands became totally totally unoccupied, but there was a private family which had been given ownership of the land. Now, what Ishiwara was proposing was to buy the rights to the land from this family. But in order to stop him, what the Japanese government did was to nationalize the land, to make the land government state-owned. Now this was perceived, because it was the Japanese state involved and taking further control over the island, this was perceived by the Chinese as an assertion of sovereignty. In other words, it was perceived as a breaking of the agreement that had been reached with Zhou Enlai in 1972 to leave the question of sovereignty from. And that has led to a very deep rift between Japan and China, hostility, almost the break-off of diplomatic relations, not a formal break-off, but a refusal to discuss policy and so on. And this, for the Americans who are the long-term competitors of China, or rather for the Americans for whom China is a long-term rising competitor for the United States, the Americans are a bit disturbed at the fact that the Japanese have created such a tense situation in Pacific. But the likelihood is that when America withdraws from the Middle East, at the moment the major preoccupation of the United States is with settling the boundaries in the Middle East, getting rid of the Assad government in Syria, and preventing Iran from having a nuclear bomb. That is the major objective of the United States policy, but meanwhile they are relatively cooperative. The objectives of when the Middle East settles down and the American military involvement in the Middle East, then they will become much more hostile to China. They will accelerate their attempts to prevent China from gaining control over the China Sea and the South China Sea and the North China Sea. So there is a very great possibility that within 20 or 30 years there will be a Chinese Navy and a Chinese Air Force which is quite capable of pushing the Americans back to Hawaii. And that will cause a great deal of tension and rivalry between the United States and China. And that is what I had chiefly in mind when I called this lecture the competition for hegemony in the West Pacific. And it's going to be tense in the future, but the great question is whether or not the economic ties between the United States and China, which are increasingly dense, whether they will prevent the actual breakout of war between China and the US. That's the great question for the next 30 years. And I mean, if there is a war, then whoever wins, as after 1945, whoever wins will be the hegemon in the West Pacific. But China will try to gain more and more influence over the other countries in the Pacific in order to gain hegemony by peaceful means. Well, I think I've talked boringly long enough, and it's time to have a discussion with you about what your views are of the questions that I have been asking.
Thank you very much, Professor. I think we have a little time to make some questions, a couple of questions. About
Right. Questions or comments?
Okay, or comments.
Yes.
Please. Oh. Okay. I think that we have to fix it. Okay. We have more class. Over.
Good afternoon. My name is Cheng Li. I'm from China. It's really interesting from you.
I can't hear you.
Yes.
Sorry. You come from China?
Yes.
Right, yes. Okay.
Good afternoon. I have found very interesting your presentation about the very hated topics in Asia, East Asia,
Yes.
Northeast Asia.
Yes.
But in your presentation, you also refer about the military budget,
Yes.
military force from China, Japan, and the United States.
Yes.
I would like to first give a comment to other people about the reality, and
Yes.
also going to have one question.
Right.
Okay, I just did a very quick research also because nowadays in China we have a very interesting topic because most of the media criticizing now Chinese military budget was increasing a lot, but what exactly the truth is our military budget only occupied our GDP less than 2%.
2%, yes.
2%.
Compared with the American 4%.
Yes.
4 or 5%.
In America is 5% and in Japan it's also 5%.
But in America, that 4 and 5% is decreasing,
It's decreasing.
whereas in China it's increasing.
Yes, in China was increasing, for example, from 2012 to 2013. The budget was increasing 10%, around 10%. Yes, that's a big concern. But the problem is that if you look at the border of China, we have 14 countries have a border,
Yes,
and you almost have 10 countries have the territorial dispute. For example, the most hated is with Japan, and the other one is with Philippines in South China Sea.
Yes, yes.
And also most, for example, with Malaysia, with Brunei,
with Malaysia,
Malaysia also have
a boundary dispute.
no, the island dispute.
Oh, I see.
With
Yes.
Malaysia, with Brunei,
Yes.
with Indonesia,
Yes.
and also with Outer Mongolia. So actually, we have 14 countries, have this dispute. We have 14 countries, 10 countries has dispute with us, and that's why occupied only 2% of the GDP. For me,
Yeah.
I would
But-
like to say it's not much.
But your 14 countries in
Yes.
Central Asia are the business of the land army, the infantry.
Yes.
The struggle with the United States is naval.
Yes.
It
exactly.
is.
In South China Sea.
China has now put its first aircraft carrier in position.
Yes.
And it's also thought that China has a missile. Most missiles are aimed at particular spots, and they land within the area of a football pitch.
Yes.
But the Chinese are supposed to develop a missile which goes round and can chase and hit an aircraft carrier.
Yeah.
Now that would very much change the nature of warfare in the.
I agree with you. That's also the most mainstream argument now towards with China's increasing of the military budget.
Yeah.
Because for example, the Japan always maintain the biggest argument. China is emerging with threat and with the threat to change the current situation.
Yes.
So my question will be about in your position also about the Dore Island, and because in the relationship between China, Japan.
So Taiwan has
was
a claim.
Also, yes. But Taiwan was involving with the situation, but it's a little bit blurry because now the relationship between China, mainland China, and Japan with Taiwan have a little bit improvement.
Right. Yes. I think I think the Chinese government is harassing the Japanese, sending planes and ships close to them.
Yeah, but the problems.
And declaring an air defense zone. But I think what the Beijing government is waiting for is an agreement with Taiwan. When they make the Hong Kong situation is one nation, two systems.
Yes.
They will agree in the end with Taiwan. I mean, ties are getting closer. One nation, three systems.
Yeah, that's also.
And when that happens, then the Taiwan claim to the Diaoyu and the Beijing claim will coincide.
That would be the kind of one
Yes,
proposal of
yes.
nowadays in China. So my question would be like, from my observation from the economic perspective. From my perspective.
Yes.
My observation.
Yes.
From the perspective of the economics aspects, when China, Korea, and Japan
Yes.
was about to build up the financial.
Sorry? Was China, Korea, and Japan?
Was about to almost to build up the financial platform.
Yes.
Without using US dollars
Yes.
as a currency for the trade.
Yen. Using yen, you mean?
Yes.
Yes.
So I would
But
like
not South Korea.
with South Korea. With South Korea.
Yeah.
So my question would be that
Yes.
you really think the United States was in a big role in this? I mean, suddenly China, Japan have disputes, Japan, Korea have disputes as well. So you really think, do you think the United States was playing a big role in this, not achieving this platform?
Sorry. Will the United States succeed in?
Succeed in not achieving by these three countries build up the financial state form without using US dollars as a currency?
Yes. Well, already, I forget what it is, something like 30% of Japan's foreign trade
Yes.
is conducted in yen. And an increasing proportion of China's foreign trade is conducted in yuan.
Yes. RMB.
Right. And the proportion of trade and of the reserves of other central banks, which is in yuan, is increasing faster than the increase in yen. Yes, yes. In other words, if this trend continues, not only will China have a military superiority in the West Pacific, but it will also have a yuan which is stronger than the dollar and replaces the dollar as the international currency for trade.
That's our
That is
president
a
of the Bank of China was always claiming in the IMF reforms for the international money,
Right.
international currency.
China is now loosening its control over the financial sector.
Because it was too much over nowadays. Yes.
Financial repression, they call it. Well, it's been interesting dialogue.
Do you have more questions? Yes? Okay, please, Professor.
Yeah,
Thank you, Professor Dore, for your interesting presentation.
come closer.
Okay. One of the most fascinating story about US-China relationships
Yes.
is that it dismisses all the talk, all the discourse
Yes,
on globalization
yes,
among friendly countries.
Right.
You probably know, of
Right.
course,
right.
the thesis, what I called in English the PDF format globalization.
Right.
I mean, peace, democracy,
I say
and free
freedom.
market go together.
Yes.
PDF
Okay.
format globalization. Of
Okay.
course, in my view, it's quite wrong.
Yeah.
So, I would just have your opinion on the very complex and interesting,
Yes.
both from economists and political
Yes.
scientists,
Yes.
the complex mix of relation between economy and politics.
Yes. Yes.
One considered one of the main turn around, so to speak, in Obama's administration policy was pivoting to Asia.
Yes.
Pivoting to Asia.
But the Middle East got so complicated
Okay.
that the pivoting was very small.
Okay.
It simply meant sending aircraft carriers to Singapore. So far.
Okay. So, in the pivoting to Asia, meaning wrongly understood as dropping the correlation with Europe by the US, and pivoting to Asia because Asia is the future, in my view it's wrong because US-European ties are very close. They are geo-economically
Right.
supported, I mean,
Yes,
with
yes,
NATO.
yes.
So it's
Yes.
important. But my question is on what is the mix of the balance of power, so to speak, between economic factors
yes.
and political factors
Yes.
in pivoting to Asia.
Yes.
I mean, on the one hand, the US are fully dependent on the China's economies, and the other way around
Right.
too. But meanwhile, China is the only country, maybe with Russia, which could become a peer competitor
Yes.
to the US. And
Yes.
probably
Yes.
everybody knows here
Yes.
that the basics of the US national strategy is to say we'll never accept in the
Right.
future to have a peer competitor at the same level as the USSR was. So what is your opinion on the relation between economic factor
Yes,
and political factor
Right.
in the US-China's
Right,
relationship?
yes.
Thank you.
American politicians frequently say, we are delighted to see China become a powerful economy and a powerful country. But we hope that China, as it develops, will conform to the international system. But the fact is there is no international system. There is an American-dominated Western system. And to ask of which PDF is a major symbol, and to ask the Chinese to accept international norms is in effect to ask them to accept American norms. And as you say, I think Japan will not succeed. Japan's financial clout is gradually diminishing and China's is increasing. I think it's very unlikely that Japan will play a pro-American role forever. I think at some point Japan will see that Japan is supposed to be a democracy, right? There is peace. There are regular elections. The elections are honest. There is very little corruption in government. And there is, in theory, freedom. But Japan is gradually becoming, with the decline in trade unions and the evaporation of the Socialist Party, Japan is increasingly becoming a quasi-totalitarian state. In other words, P and D, but not F. I am a victim of this. I have written a book called Japan's Post-War Suicidal Move to the Right. And nobody will publish it I mean, all the publishers that I used to go with, Iwanami and Chuo Koron, so Chuo Koron sold a book of mine on finance and sold 40,000 copies. But my last work, which predicted that China would inevitably oust the United States, was extremely unpopular. The publishers received, I don't know whether they actually had threats, but they certainly had pressure from the government not to advertise the book. and as a result, I mean, compared with the 40,000 copies I had before, it sold less than 9,000 copies. And now those publishers and the other publishers refuse to publish my latest book. So Japan is a country in which freedom of expression is gradually diminishing. Whereas I think in China, it's gradually increasing. China has moves in jumps and starts because of the Olympics. There was a big lifting of the control over dissident Chinese, and then afterwards there was repression. Some of the dissidents were sent off to agriculture and things like that. But China's long-term trend is towards not necessarily the election of the central government, but towards more freedom of criticism of the central government on the web, Facebook, Twitter, etc. This is becoming increasingly difficult to control for China. You know that they insisted that Google should subject itself to censorship and not allow that there should be a barrier at the internet. But you can't do that forever. And the one thing that is truly universal is the internet. A major product of American technology. And the internet means that within individual countries, the control over information becomes very difficult, because you can always log on to some subversive site and gather companions, allies through the social media. So the question of China adopting PDF is really a question of China accepting American norms, and it's not prepared to do that.
Questions?
Yes.
Okay. Professor, thank you very much for your interesting conference. I was wondering if you could make some comments about this recent episode involving Russia and Ukraine.
Yes.
Yes, because I was thinking about the position of China in this conflict.
Yes.
And do you think the position of China is an important issue, an important
factor in the Ukrainian
making of
yes.
American strategy nowadays,
right.
or not?
No.
Because
yes.
this type of alignment.
Right. Right. Now, China's involvement is at the moment marginal in the Ukraine system. We talk about states. Frequently we use the word nation state and state as synonyms. And in the case of China, 97% of the people of China are Han Chinese. with a shared culture. I mean, China is a nation with a state. But Ukraine was never a nation state. Ukraine was divided between the people who spoke Russian, who in Crimea were 90% of the people. Within Ukraine itself, the people who spoke Russian and the people who spoke Ukrainian were never able to create a common culture and a common sense of being Ukrainians. Always the Russian speakers were drawn towards Russia, and the Ukrainian speakers were given the opportunity by the European Union of working towards the inclusion of Ukraine in the European common market. Now that attempt on the part of the European Union aroused Russian, because it would shift the frontier between the American power bloc and the Russian power bloc from the borders of Poland back further towards the center of the heart of Russia. So that was why I think Russia reacted so strongly, and I think that the solution which will eventually be raised is the division of Ukraine into a Russian-speaking, something like a nation, yes, the division of Ukraine into a Russian-speaking part and a Ukrainian-speaking part as two separate states. And when that happens, they will have reasonably, I mean, the frontier between the American power bloc and the Russian power bloc will then shift to the middle of Ukraine. I think the Americans could, I mean, both the Americans and the Russians could live with that. Now, China has been very guarded in its statements about Ukraine, because one of the key factors in Chinese policy from the very beginning is a renunciation of the interference in the domestic politics of other countries. Now, what's happening in Ukraine is enormous interference with the domestic politics on the part of Russia and on the part of the European Union. So the Chinese, in order to be consistent, are repeating this line: there should be no interference in domestic policy, and we should leave it to the Ukrainians to settle themselves. An equally interesting question is why China said yes. Yes.
I agree with you that China did not put its veto, but only vote abstention.
Yes,
at the Security Council.
Council.
It did not propose her veto.
No. Right. Yes.
So
no, you're right.
China
They abstained because they hold to the principle of non-interference, but because they didn't vote against, because they didn't want to provoke the Americans. Yeah. And an equally interesting question is why China agrees to the sanctions on Iran. And I think one of the answers to that is that China has technological ties with Israel that are very important to China. And consequently, the other day, 2 or 3 weeks ago, there was heavy snow in eastern North America. The Brookings Institute, which is one of the most respected research institutes, the Brookings Institute was organizing a seminar between the United States, China, and the European Union. But the snowstorm meant that nobody could go. So instead, they put it online. They put it on the internet, and you can actually see the discussion. It's very obvious that China very much values its ties with Israel, and is trying at the moment the export of technology which has any possible military use from Israel to China is vetoed by the United States. There was an agreement to one technology agreement on which the Chinese had already paid the deposit, but the Americans intervened and told Israel that they're not allowed to send that technology to China, and they had to get their deposit back. That, I think, is one of the major reasons why China hitherto has not opposed sanctions in the Security Council on the on Syria and Iran. But how long that will last, I'm not sure.
Sorry.
Right. Yes.
Take another question. I'm really interested with these topics. The other question is about the trade. The trade, international trade. International trade, WTO.
WTO, yes. Yes.
I really agree with you that nowadays United States really wants China you should take the international rules as American rules.
Yes.
So nowadays, I think since 2001, China joined WTO.
Yes.
Almost all the countries claiming China was the most beneficial country in WTO.
Right, yes.
And also after 2000, also in the same year, in the Doha meeting,
yes,
there's no substantial reforms in WTO itself.
Yes.
So now United States, together with other countries, they created the TPP.
Yes.
Trans-Pacific Partnership and TTIP.
The Trans-Pacific
Partnership and the TTIP.
Yes.
Transparent Partnership with Investment Partnership. So, but within these two frameworks, there's no China, because we are not able to join.
Right.
So, what's your perspective?
Well, the purpose of the TPP is to make the economic frontier coincide with the military frontier.
Yes.
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 I mean, obviously, they talk about China joining, but it's nonsense. It is directed at China.
Yeah, but the point, my question would be ask you, because nowadays, if instead of taking China away from this regional partnership,
yes,
for United States, I think it would be much beneficial still maintain China, because the biggest market.
Yes.
So what would you think in this situation in China? Is possible to join TPP or TTIP or not possible?
No, I don't think the American, the enhancement of trade and prosperity, which would be brought by the TPP and creation of both, is marginal.
But I would like to
and I think the major objective of the TPP, as I said, is to exclude China.
Yeah.
And to reinforce ties between South Korea and Japan. And if they could do so also with Taiwan. But of course, but of course, if there were ever a one nation, three system, Taiwan would no longer be buying arms, buying fighters from the United States. It would mean cutting off his ties with the United States.
But I also read some papers nowadays in China.
Yes.
For example, with the second economics United States trying to exclude from China to build up this regional partnership. You
Yeah.
really think it's going to work or not?
The regional partnership.
This regional partnership with TPP,
Well,
TTIP,
you know,
without China, you
there-
really think it's working or
There
not?
is also a tentative attempt to create a counter TPP, joining Japan, South Korea, and China.
Uh-huh.
And they frequently have meetings in one or the other country, but nothing yet has developed. But that was prompted as a defense against TPP.
Okay. But
Yeah.
also there's another fact. For example, in China last year, we have the Shanghai Free Trade Pilot Zone. You know that?
Shanghai Free
Shanghai
Trade.
Free Trade Zone.
Yes.
Pilot.
Oh, yes, yes.
Most of scholars in China, they think this Shanghai Free Zone is a preparation to join TPP.
Really?
Yeah, because
I see.
in this
I
free
see.
zone we have the blacklist. We used to don't have blacklist for the people enter in the free zone.
Yes.
For example, in the special economic
In
zone,
Shenzhen?
Shenzhen was special economic zone.
Yes.
Shenzhen is special economic zone. We don't have the blacklist.
Right.
We only have the list. You can come in with
Right,
this area.
yes, yes, yes.
But with Shanghai, we do the blacklist for the first time. That's why the scholars in China they said we are trying to prepare for joint TPP
Really?
because
I
it's
see.
black.
Aha. Well, that's very interesting. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
More questions? Then Professor, thank you very much for your exposition. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you.
A very rambling presentation, I'm afraid. But nevertheless, and I enjoyed the dialogue.